There are moments in sport that don't just surprise you. They restructure you. They reach into the framework of assumptions you had carefully built about a person, about an institution, about the nature of loyalty and principle, and the things people say when they believe they mean them. And they dismantle that framework so completely that you find yourself sitting with the wreckage, trying to remember what the structure looked like before it fell. This is one of those moments. Rory McIlroy, the man who testified before Congress in defense of the PGA Tour, who called LIV Golf a disruption to the sport he loved, who looked into cameras week after week and year after year, and spoke with the specific conviction of someone who had not merely chosen a side, but had become the side, has signed with LIV Golf. Read that sentence again if you need to, because the golf world needed to read it several times before it became real. The player who sacrificed more public capital defending the tour than any other human being in the sport. The player whose identity, whose narrative, whose entire post-major drought public story had become inseparable from the idea of standing for something. That player is now wearing the logo of the league he spent years treating as the opposition. And in the silence that followed the announcement, before the reactions and the takes and the institutional statements began to flood in, there was just that silence. The sound of an entire sport trying to process the unprocessable. If you've been following this channel through every chapter of the Gulf War, and what a war it has been, you know we don't do surface-level takes here. We go deep. Hit subscribe right now because this story is going to keep moving, and the full picture matters more than the headline ever will. To understand what Rory McIlroy signing with LIV Golf actually means, not just as a news event, but as a human story, you have to go back. Not to last year. Not to the framework agreement. You have to go back to the beginning of his public role in this conflict, because that beginning is where the emotional weight of this moment was first accumulated. When LIV Golf launched and the defections began, Rory didn't stay quiet the way many players chose to. He spoke, loudly, repeatedly, with a passion that went beyond strategic positioning, the kind of passion that, when you watch it now in retrospect, looks less like a calculated public relations decision and more like a man who genuinely believed what he was saying and needed the world to believe it alongside him. He called LIV a threat to the game's integrity. He described the guaranteed money as antithetical to the competitive spirit that makes golf worth watching. He framed his own decision to stay on the PGA Tour not as a financial calculation, though the numbers were never unfavorable for a player of his stature, but as a values decision, a character decision. The kind of decision that defines what kind of person you are and what kind of legacy you leave. That framing was powerful. It was also, in retrospect, a trap. Not a trap set by anyone else. A trap he built for himself, with the best of intentions, in the full sincerity of someone who truly believed the institution he was defending deserved defending. Because when you build your public identity around a values position, you don't just make a career choice. You make a promise. And promises, especially public ones made with genuine conviction, have a weight that outlasts the circumstances that produced them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever defended something publicly, staked your credibility on it, and then watched the thing you defended reveal itself to be smaller than you believed? Because that is the human core of what we are watching happen to Rory McIlroy right now. The timeline of what changed is important because this decision did not happen overnight. The seeds of it were planted, with painful irony, in the very framework agreement that Rory helped champion as the solution to the conflict he had been the face of opposing. When the PGA Tour and the Public Investment Fund announced their framework agreement, the same Saudi money behind LIV Golf, it bears repeating, the reaction among tour loyalists was complicated. Rory's reaction was among the most complicated of all. He had been, by multiple accounts, kept out of the loop on the negotiations. The organization whose public face he had voluntarily become had reached its most significant strategic decision without fully including the player who had spent 2 years absorbing reputational damage on its behalf. That exclusion was not announced. It emerged gradually, through reporting and through the careful way Rory began choosing his words in the period following the announcement. The warmth went out of his tour advocacy, not overnight, gradually, the way heat leaves a room after the fire goes out. Imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. Subsequent developments accelerated the cooling. The promised structural reforms moved slower than the rhetoric had suggested they would. The player governance conversations that were meant to give tour members genuine organizational voice produced committees and working groups rather than the fundamental power shifts that had been implied. And through all of it, Rory, who had been the most credible voice for the tour's moral position precisely because he was a player rather than an administrator, found himself in the increasingly untenable position of defending decisions he hadn't been part of making to an audience that was running out of patience with the explanations. Here is the moment that many insiders believe was the true turning point, not the framework agreement itself, but a specific private conversation that occurred in its aftermath. The details are not fully public and may never be, but multiple sources within the player community have described a meeting or series of meetings in which Rory sought direct answers about governance commitments and player equity arrangements and received responses that fell significantly short of what had been publicly promised in the language surrounding the framework deal. What those conversations apparently communicated to Rory, beneath the institutional language and the strategic framing, was something he had not allowed himself to fully consider during the years he spent publicly defending the tour. That the organization's loyalty to him, to any player, was fundamentally instrumental. That the relationship between the tour and even its most valuable advocates was transactional in ways that the moral vocabulary used to describe it had always obscured. That realization, when it comes, doesn't make you angry immediately. It makes you quiet. It makes you reassess not just the present situation, but everything that led to it. Every interview, every congressional testimony, every time you looked into a camera and said, with full conviction, that this was the right side to be on. And somewhere in that reassessment, something that had felt like loyalty begins to feel like something else. Something that was perhaps taken advantage of. If this moment feels too familiar, if watching Rory's quiet reassessment reminds you of your own, then press that button on the screen, because this channel is for people who take these human stories seriously. The LIV Golf signing itself, when it came, was handled with a precision that reflected how carefully both sides had managed the lead-up. The announcement was not a leak. It was not a dramatic press conference designed for maximum spectacle. It was controlled, almost clinical, the kind of announcement that communicates that both parties had been prepared for the reaction and had made a mutual decision that the story would be told on their terms rather than anyone else's. Rory's statement was brief by the standards of what the moment deserved. It spoke of new challenges, of continuing to compete at the highest level, of respect for the tour that had been his professional home. What it did not contain, and this absence was as loud as anything it did contain, was any of the moral vocabulary that had defined his previous public communications about professional golf's conflict. No talk of integrity, no talk of what the game stands for, no framing of the decision in terms of values or legacy or the soul of the sport. Just a player announcing a professional decision in the language of professional decisions. That absence of moral framing was itself a statement. It was Rory McIlroy declining to construct a new narrative to justify the one he was leaving behind. It was, in its own quiet way, more honest than most announcements of this kind tend to be. And honesty, even when it arrives in the form of devastating silence, deserves to be recognized for what it is. The PGA Tour's reaction arrived in the form of an official statement within hours of the announcement. And the statement was a masterpiece of institutional language deployed in service of saying as little as possible while appearing to say something meaningful. It wished Rory well. It referenced the tour's commitment to the best players competing on the best stages. It used the word evolution in a context that suggested whoever wrote it had spent considerable time choosing a word that could not be directly quoted against the organization in future coverage. What the statement did not do, what it conspicuously, pointedly, almost aggressively did not do, was acknowledge the specific weight of this particular defection. The loss of any player is manageable in institutional communications. The loss of Rory McIlroy is not just the loss of a player. It is the loss of the argument. Because Rory was not simply a talent asset for the PGA Tour. He was the living embodiment of their position in the conflict with LIV. He was the proof that the right players, for the right reasons, chose the right organization. Without him in that role, without the moral authority his presence conferred on the tour's narrative, the institutional story the tour has been telling about itself for 3 years requires fundamental revision. And institutions do not revise their fundamental stories easily or quickly or honestly. They absorb the blow, redeploy the language, and hope that the audience has a shorter memory than the historical record. What happens now, to Rory, to the tour, to the sport, is the question that every golf fan is sitting with tonight. And the honest answer, the one that respects the intelligence of the people asking it, is that nobody knows with certainty. What we can say is this: Rory McIlroy on LIV Golf will be must-watch television in a way that almost nothing in professional golf has been must-watch television since Tiger Woods was in his prime. The drama of watching the sport's most eloquent defender of one league compete under the banner of the league he defended against, that drama is not manufactured. It is real and it is human, and it will be present in every round he plays, every interview he gives, every time a journalist asks him a question that connects his current present to his recent past. That humanity, that visible complexity of a person navigating the consequences of a genuinely difficult choice made under genuinely difficult circumstances, is ultimately what sport is for. Not the institutional politics, not the boardroom negotiations, not the framework agreements and the governance committees and the commissioner statements. The human beings. The players who carry the weight of these stories in their bodies onto courses every week and compete anyway, because the competition is still real even when everything around it has become complicated beyond recognition. Rory McIlroy is still one of the greatest golfers alive. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the story he carries onto the course with him. And that story, his story, the full, honest weight of it, is one worth following wherever it leads next, because it is the truest mirror the sport has right now of what professional golf actually is and what it might still become.